What if the story of one boy's life held secrets, cruelty, betrayal, lost love, and the painful question of whether we ever truly escape our childhood? David Copperfield begins as an innocent child, but the world around him is far from gentle. He is pushed into hardship, surrounded by people who may save him, use him, or break him. And as he grows from a frightened boy into a man, one mystery remains. Will David become the hero of his own life, or will the past decide his future for him? I'm Roger Braveheart, and a very warm welcome to the 60-Minute Stories channel. These stories are for anyone who has ever wished they had read the great classics at school, but never quite got around to it. By the end, you'll understand the story well enough to enjoy it, remember it, and sound a little more well-read when it comes up in conversation. Okay, so, without further delay, let's get cracking. David Copperfield begins his story at the very beginning, telling us that he was born on a Friday at midnight in a quiet country house, 6 months after the death of his father. On the night of his birth, his sharp and formidable great-aunt, Betsy Trotwood, arrives unannounced, fully expecting the child to be a girl whom she means to guard and shape. When the doctor gently reports that the baby is a boy, the aunt walks out in disgust and is not seen again for years. David grows up in the warm company of his pretty, gentle young mother and their devoted servant, Peggotty, whose rough red hands and endless darning he remembers with love. These early days are happy and tender, filled with firelight, churchyard walks, and stories read aloud. But a shadow soon falls across the home. A dark-haired, hard-eyed gentleman begins to walk his mother home from church, and to charm her with his deep voice and watchful manner. David instinctively dislikes him, and so does Peggotty, who senses danger in the courtship. To get the boy out of the way, Peggotty proposes a holiday, and David is taken to her brother's home at Yarmouth. There he discovers a wonderful house made out of an old upturned boat, snug and tarred and full of strange comforts. The household is a gathering of kind, generous, weather-beaten people. The warm-hearted fisherman, who is the master of the boat, his nephew Ham, the orphaned little Emily, and a perpetually mournful widow who feels every misfortune more deeply than anyone else. David and little Emily wander the beach together, picking up shells and pebbles, and he falls into a sweet, childish love for her, untroubled by any thought of the future. He learns the sad histories that bind the household together, the drownings that have left so many of them orphaned, and the open-handed kindness of the man who has taken them all in. Emily speaks longingly of one day becoming a lady, and David glimpses something restless and yearning beneath her bright charm. The fortnight slips happily away, but when David returns home, he senses at once that everything has changed. A strange servant opens the door, and Peggotty, hesitant and tearful, breaks the news that he now has a new father. In the best parlour, he finds his mother seated nervously beside the dark gentleman, who instructs her to control herself and greets the boy with cold authority. David's old bedroom has been changed. The warm, familiar feeling of home has been blown away, and a fierce black dog now growls at him from the yard. Through David's bewildered child's eyes, we feel the gentle world of his infancy closing, and we sense that the man who has married his mother brings with him a hardness and a chill that will shape the boy's life for years to come. So begins a story of love, of loss, and of looming menace, as a tender child watches the brightness of his earliest days fade, and a cold new master take hold of his home. David remembers it all with aching clearness, the warmth of his mother's hair drooping over him, the smell of the churchyard grass, the snug, fire-lit boat by the sea, and then the slow, creeping arrival of fear into the only happiness he has ever known. Even as a small boy, he can read the change in the air, the way his mother grows timid and watchful, the way Peggotty falls silent and out of sorts, and the way the doors of his home seem to shut against the gentle past. David's new life under his stepfather grows steadily darker. Mr. Murdstone and his grim, jail-keeping sister settle into the home, bringing with them a creed they call firmness, which David quickly understands to be nothing more than tyranny dressed up as discipline. His gentle mother is bent to their will, allowed no opinion that is not first approved by them, and forbidden to show her boy too much affection. David's lessons, once a path of flowers learned at his mother's knee, become a daily misery, watched over by the two cold figures until the words slip from his frightened head. One terrible morning, after another impossible lesson, his stepfather beats him with a cane, and David, in pain and terror, bites the hand that holds him. For this he is shut up alone for 5 days, treated as a wicked criminal, and then sent away. Through the keyhole, his loving nurse whispers her devotion and the news that he is bound for a school near London. Before he leaves, his mother holds up his baby brother for him to see, a silent farewell image he will carry for the rest of his life. On the journey, the slow carrier who drives him sends a curious message of courtship to Peggotty, declaring himself willing, and David sees something of the cruelty and indifference of the wider world at the inns along the road. At Salem House, the school is empty for the holidays, and David is humiliated by being made to wear a placard on his back, warning that he bites as though he were a dangerous dog. A kind but downtrodden teacher looks after him, a poor man whose mother lives in an almshouse, and David glimpses the man's gentleness and his shame. When the term begins, the school is revealed to be a place of sheer cruelty, ruled by a savage, whispering proprietor who delights in beating the boys, and enforced by a brutal one-legged man. David is befriended, however, by an older, handsome, confident boy named Steerforth, who is the unchallenged king of the school, and the one pupil the master never dares to strike. Steerforth takes charge of David's money, his stories, and his admiration, and David falls completely under the spell of his easy charm and natural power. Steerforth can do anything, and seems to fear nothing. When the gentle teacher is publicly disgraced and dismissed, partly through Steerforth's careless cruelty in exposing the man's poverty, David feels a pang of guilt, for it was he who innocently shared the secret. Yet his devotion to Steerforth only deepens. The fishing household sends a visit and gifts of seafood, and David proudly shows off his glorious new friend, who charms the simple, kindly relations of his nurse without effort. David begins to see Steerforth as the sun to all lesser lights, never suspecting the danger hidden in such a winning, careless nature. Here we watch a tender child broken by harshness, and we watch his heart bind itself for the first time to a friend whose brilliance shines so brightly that David cannot see the ruin it may one day bring. Through all the beatings, the cold lessons, and the lonely placard, the boy clings to the few who are gentle to him, and most of all to the dazzling older boy who makes him feel chosen and safe. David's first half year at the cruel school passes in a haze of beatings, fear, and the small comfort of telling stories to Steerforth in the dark. When the holidays come, he travels home, and the slow carrier presses on with his strange wordless courtship of Peggotty, even chalking her name inside his cart. At home, David finds his mother gentler and sadder, now nursing a new baby brother, and for one happy evening, with the stepfather and his sister away, the old warmth returns. But the visit soon sours under the cold watchfulness of the Murdstones, and David is made to feel a stranger in his own home, forbidden to take refuge with his nurse, and kept on display in the parlour like a constant offence. He returns to school carrying the silent image of his mother, holding up her baby at the gate. Not long after, on the morning of his birthday, he is called from the schoolroom and told gently by the schoolmaster's wife that his mother is dead, and that his baby brother has died too. David is taken home for the funeral, and a kindly undertaker drives him there, while David watches the cheerful work of the living and feels cast away among them. His nurse tells him tenderly how his mother faded and died, blessing her fatherless boy with her last words, and David remembers his mother only as she was in her young beauty, dancing with him by the firelight. After the burial, David falls into neglect. His nurse is given notice, but before she leaves, she takes him for a fortnight to the seaside boat home, where the kindly fisherman, his nephew, and little Emily welcome him again. Emily has grown more womanly, sly and shy at once, and David's old childish love stirs anew. Meanwhile, the slow carrier finally wins his nurse, and the two are quietly married, with David and Emily riding along as delighted witnesses. He learns that the carrier is something of a miser, hiding his money in a box he calls only old clothes. When the visit ends, David is left in the desolate, untaught life the Murdstones intend for him, slighted and overlooked, finding comfort only in his father's old books. At last his stepfather decides to be rid of him. David is told that he is to go to London to work for his living in a wine warehouse connected with his stepfather's business, washing bottles among common men and boys. So, at 10 years old, dressed in mourning and clutching a small trunk, he is sent away to begin life on his own account, watching his old home, the churchyard, and the empty sky shrink behind him as he goes. This is the deepest loss of David's childhood, the death of the gentle mother who had been his whole world, and it leaves him drifting into a cold, working life that no child so young should ever have to bear. He carries with him only the memory of her young face, the kindness of his nurse, and a quiet, lonely courage that will have to serve him in the hard days ahead, with no one left to shield him from the harshness now closing in. David's working life in the riverside warehouse is a secret agony. A child of quick mind and tender feeling, he is set to washing and labelling bottles alongside rougher boys, and he weeps over his lost hopes of becoming a learned man. He keeps his own counsel and does his work, but the shame and loneliness are almost unbearable. His lodging is arranged with a stout, shabby, grandly spoken gentleman named Mr. Micawber and his devoted wife, a couple forever sinking under debts yet forever hopeful that something will turn up. David becomes deeply attached to them, helping Mrs. Micawber pawn their few possessions and listening to her tearful confidences and her husband's flowery despair. When Mr. Micawber is at last arrested for debt and carried off to the debtor's prison, David visits him there and is given a piece of advice he never forgets, that a small yearly income carefully kept means happiness, while spending a little beyond it means misery. After a time, the family's affairs are settled, Mr. Micawber is released, and they resolve to leave London to seek their fortune elsewhere. The parting wounds David deeply, for these warm, ridiculous, kindly people have been his only friends. Left utterly alone in the world, with no advice, no comfort, and no hope of rescue from his cruel relations, David forms a desperate resolution. He remembers the dread great-aunt who came on the night of his birth, the only relation he has, and he determines to run away to her and throw himself on her mercy. He writes to his nurse for her address and a little money, learns that the aunt lives near Dover, and plans his escape for the end of the week. But disaster strikes at once. A long-legged young man hired to carry his box cheats him, snatching his half-guinea and making off with his trunk, leaving David with almost nothing. Panting, weeping, and robbed, the boy sets out on foot, determined to walk all the way to Dover. He sells his waistcoat and then his jacket to buy bread, sleeps rough behind walls and haystacks, and is frightened and even attacked by tramps on the road, one of whom takes his handkerchief and knocks down the woman travelling with him. Through it all, David is sustained by a tender, imagined picture of his young mother, relenting toward him, which seems to walk before him and lead him on. Footsore, sunburnt, ragged and half-starved, he arrives at last in Dover and searches for his aunt, mocked by boatmen and shopkeepers until a kindly fly-driver points the way. He comes to a neat cottage and finds the formidable old lady in her garden, and stammering out who he is, he breaks down completely. Betsy Trotwood, after a moment of utter astonishment, takes him in, bathes him, feeds him, and shelters him for the night, while her gentle, simple-minded companion advises, in all seriousness, that the boy should be washed and put to bed. So David passes from the depths of friendless labour, where he wept among the bottles and clung to a kindly, debt-ridden household, to the very threshold of a new and uncertain refuge, exhausted and frightened, yet daring to hope that the dread aunt of his birth might prove a kinder protector than the cruel stepfather who has thrown him away. David's fate now rests with his aunt, Betsy Trotwood, a sharp, eccentric and surprisingly kind old lady who wages constant war on the donkeys that dare to cross her green. She takes counsel with her gentle, simple-minded companion, who is happily occupied with a memorial he can never finish, and a great kite on which he pastes his thoughts to fly them into the sky. The aunt writes to the Murdstones, and in time the stepfather and his grim sister arrive to reclaim the boy. But Betsy Trotwood sees through their cruelty at once. She listens to David's tearful plea not to be given back, hears the stepfather's cold demand to take the boy away unconditionally, and then drives the pair off with fierce contempt, declaring that she will keep David herself. From that moment, she adopts him, renames him Trotwood Copperfield, and begins to shape him into the firm, self-reliant man she hopes he will become. David's new life feels like a dream after the misery he has known. His aunt arranges for him to attend a good school at Canterbury, and while seeking lodgings takes him to the house of her lawyer and friend, the father of Agnes Wickfield. There David first meets Agnes, whose calm, gentle good nature strikes him at once, and whom he forever after associates with a tranquil light, like a stained glass window in a church. He also meets with a deep instinctive unease the lawyer's cadaverous red-haired clerk, Uriah Heep, whose clammy hand, sleepless red eyes, and endless professions of being humble fill David with discomfort. It is arranged that David shall board in the lawyer's house, and his aunt leaves him there with 3 pieces of advice that he treasures: never to be mean, never to be false, and never to be cruel. David settles happily into the household, growing close to Agnes, who quietly helps him with his books and becomes a steadying influence on his whole life. His new school is everything the cruel one was not, run on honour and trust by a kindly, absent-minded scholar, forever lost in compiling a great dictionary, and David thrives there. He learns something of the schoolmaster's young wife and her poor relations, and witnesses a strange, troubling scene at a farewell party for the wife's idle cousin, who is sent abroad. The wife faints, a cherry ribbon is lost, and David later glimpses her gazing up at her husband with a face full of some unspeakable horror and appeal that he cannot understand, but never forgets. Meanwhile, Uriah Heep continues to fascinate and repel David, declining all kindness, pretending to be too lowly to learn, and prophesying in his oily way that David will one day come into the lawyer's business. David visits the clerk's mother and finds himself wormed for confidences by the two of them, sensing the cunning beneath their crawling humility. He even dreams uneasily of the clerk turning pirate. After the misery of his earliest years, David has at last been lifted into safety, learning, and friendship, watched over by his sharp but loving aunt and by the gentle Agnes. Yet beneath all this new happiness, the crawling humility of Uriah Heep and the slow decline of Agnes's father quietly hint that trouble is taking root in the very household where David has found his home. David grows up in the calm of Canterbury, writing to his nurse and learning that the carrier remains a good if near husband, that his old home stands shut and abandoned, and that the Murdstones have gone away. His gentle, simple-minded fellow lodger visits him, confiding a mystery about a frightening man who lurks near his aunt's house, and to whom she secretly gives money, a riddle David cannot solve but which troubles him. These visits become the happiest days of the gentleman's life, and he charms the whole school, and even befriends the kindly old schoolmaster who reads scraps of his great dictionary aloud as they walk. David's boyhood passes in a haze of small loves and rivalries, a childish passion for one young lady at a neighbouring school, a famous fight with a young butcher who insults the scholars, and at last a romantic worship of an older beauty who marries someone else. He rises to be head of the school, watched over always by the quiet goodness of Agnes, who has grown into a young woman and remains his counsellor and better angel. When his school days end, his aunt sends him on a leisurely journey to look about him and find his own mind, advising him above all to grow into a firm fellow of strong character. David goes first to Canterbury to take leave of Agnes and her father, and there he notices with concern that the lawyer has fallen into a habit of drink, growing nervous and haggard, often called away on business by the humble clerk, Uriah Heep. Agnes, in a moment of trust, asks David whether he too has seen the change in her father, and her loving, fearful devotion to him moves David deeply. He senses a dark cloud gathering over the household, and a vague dread of some great affliction and disgrace that has no shape yet. He also observes again the strange, troubled friendship between the schoolmaster's young wife and Agnes, and the uneasy watchfulness of the lawyer, and the old memory of that night's lost ribbon returns to him with a darker meaning. Setting out at last, David travels up to London, suffering a small humiliation when a shabby stranger takes his coveted box seat on the coach, which leaves him feeling young and uncertain. In London, he goes to the theatre, intoxicated by the glory of the play, and returning late to his hotel, he becomes dimly aware of a handsome young man already in the coffee room. To his astonishment and delight, he recognises Steerforth, the admired friend of his school days. The two greet each other with overflowing warmth, and Steerforth, easy, charming, and superior as ever, takes David under his wing once more, arranging better rooms for him and inviting him to breakfast. David, overjoyed, dreams of ancient Rome and friendship, never suspecting what this renewed bond will bring. With his boyhood now behind him and his school days closed, David stands on the edge of his grown-up life, and at this very threshold, the dazzling friend of his childhood comes back into his world, bringing with him the warmth, the brilliance, and the hidden danger that will one day shape the saddest events David ever has to live through. David accepts Steerforth's invitation to visit his home at Highgate, where he meets Steerforth's proud, doting mother and her fierce, scarred companion, a thin, dark, watchful woman whose every question carries a hidden sting. Steerforth confesses that he himself gave her that scar long ago by throwing a hammer at her in a boyish rage, and David senses some buried passion and danger in the household. The mother lives only for her son and frets over his wild ways at college, while her companion probes and insinuates, mocking the lower classes and asking with cruel sweetness whether such people truly feel as their betters do. Steerforth's manner toward David is affectionate and a little careless, treating him fondly as a kind of plaything, and calling him Daisy for his freshness and innocence, which only deepens David's devotion. After a happy week of riding, fencing, and boxing lessons, watched over by Steerforth's coldly respectable manservant, who always makes David feel very young, the two friends travel down to Yarmouth so that David can visit his old nurse, Peggotty, and the fishing household. There David finds Peggotty married, and her husband, the carrier, bedridden with rheumatism and miserly to the last, hiding his money and pretending to sleep before producing a single coin. Steerforth charms them all utterly, winning the simple hearts of the fishing family with his easy grace, his fine voice, and his gift for entering into anyone's feelings. The great event of the visit is the betrothal of little Emily, now grown into a beautiful young woman, to her cousin, the kindly boatman who has loved her since childhood. Mr. Peggotty tells the story with overflowing joy, and the household clasps hands in happiness, while David is moved almost to tears by their honest devotion. Steerforth helps the moment along with perfect skill, charming Emily and putting everyone at ease, and David admires him more than ever, believing his friend feels the same warm sympathy he feels himself. Yet there are shadows. As they leave one night, a dark figure follows Emily and her betrothed along the sands, and Steerforth wonders aloud what such a black shadow means. It proves to be a fallen woman of the town, once Emily's friend, who begs Emily for mercy and money, and Emily, weeping, helps her and confesses to her betrothed and her aunt that she fears she is not as good a girl as she ought to be. David also encounters a comic, sharp-witted dwarf hairdresser who tends Steerforth's hair and chatters of the great people she serves, and Steerforth muses uneasily about people of the fishing class being mere clods who do not feel. Steerforth buys a boat at Yarmouth, intending to have it named after little Emily, and pretends his generosity to Mr. Peggotty is mere whim. David sees only kindness and brilliance in his friend, and never the careless cruelty beneath. So the two worlds of David's life are drawn together, the proud Steerforth household and the humble fishing home, and quietly, without his ever seeing it, the seeds of a coming betrayal are sown that will one day shatter the happiness of the people he loves most. David parts from Steerforth and turns to choosing a profession. His aunt, Betsy Trotwood, suggests he become a proctor in the old, sleepy world of Doctors' Commons, a quaint legal backwater near St. Paul's, and David, advised by Steerforth, agrees. He joins his aunt in London, who fusses about fire and pickpockets, and together they visit the offices where David is to be articled for £1,000. He learns that one partner is forever blamed as the immovable obstacle to any kindness, though David never quite makes out which partner truly objects to anything. On the way, his aunt is strangely agitated by a shabby, ill-dressed man who follows them, and she goes off alone with him in a coach, giving him money, a mystery David cannot fathom, but which she begs him never to mention. David takes pleasant chambers in the Adelphi, looked after by a stout landlady who declares she will yearn toward him as a son, and he revels in the dignity of living on his own account. He soon hosts a riotous housewarming dinner for Steerforth and 2 friends, drinks far too much and disgraces himself, ending the night at the theatre where, to his horror, he encounters Agnes. Sober and ashamed the next day, he receives a kind note from her and calls on her, weeping with self-reproach. Agnes gently warns him against his friend, whom she calls his bad angel, urging him to be careful of Steerforth's influence, though David, loyal as ever, defends him. Agnes confides her own trouble. The humble red-haired clerk is worming his way into a partnership with her father, having mastered the lawyer's weaknesses until the old man is afraid of him. She begs David to be friendly to the clerk for her father's sake. David also reunites with an old schoolfellow, the good-natured Traddles, now reading for the bar and lodging by strange coincidence with the Micawbers, who have reappeared, as hopeful and as harassed by debt as ever. David sees with unease the humble clerk drawing the trusting Mr. Micawber into his confidence. Articled at last to the proctors, David settles into a quiet, lonely routine. Then his employer invites him to his country house, and there David is utterly undone. He meets the man's daughter, Dora, a small, enchanting, childlike beauty, and falls instantly and hopelessly in love. To his dismay, her companion turns out to be none other than the grim sister of his cruel stepfather, and the two agree to meet as distant acquaintances. David is swallowed up in adoration, dining off the sight of Dora, jealous of everyone, and wandering miles in hope of a glimpse of her. His shrewd landlady soon guesses there is a lady in the case, and advises him kindly to know his own worth. So David is launched upon his profession. The menace of the creeping clerk grows darker over the family Agnes loves, and David himself is plunged headlong into the dizzy, foolish, tender first passion of his youth, with no thought for anything in the world but the bewitching little creature who has captured his heart. David visits his old schoolfellow Traddles in his modest lodgings, and learns of his cheerful, hard-working life, his patient engagement to a curate's daughter who is one of 10, and his motto of wait and hope. He discovers that Traddles boards with the Micawbers, and is already entangled in Mr. Micawber's debts. At a stiff, genteel dinner party, David meets Traddles again and watches the humble clerk hover near Agnes with greedy, shadowless eyes. Worse follows when the clerk invites himself to David's chambers and, with crawling triumph, reveals that he loves Agnes, and means one day to make her his wife, having made himself indispensable to her failing father. David is filled with loathing and dread, but mindful of Agnes's plea, holds his peace through a sleepless, tormented night. He sees the clerk off with Agnes the next day, sick at the danger hanging over her. David throws himself harder than ever into his love for Dora, prowling round her house by night. Settling his old nurse's affairs as a proud young proctor, he encounters his stepfather again, taking out a marriage license for a young new wife, and David and Peggotty coldly rebuff the man whose cruelty helped kill his mother. David's employer invites him to celebrate Dora's birthday at a picnic, where David, maddened by jealousy of a red-whiskered rival, nearly spoils the day until the sympathetic friend of Dora reconciles them. Soon afterward, calling at the friend's house, David seizes his chance and pours out his love, and to his rapture Dora accepts him. The two become secretly engaged, keeping it from her father, exchanging tokens and quarrelling and making up through their go-between. Meanwhile, a darker storm gathers. David goes down to Yarmouth as the carrier lies dying and learns from the undertaker that little Emily, soon to be married, has grown unsettled and full of dread. He sits with the dying carrier, who at last goes out with the tide, murmuring that he was always willing. But the true blow falls the next night. After the carrier's death and the settling of his hidden hoard, David returns to the boat home expecting a quiet evening, only to find Emily's betrothed at the door, deadly pale and broken-hearted. Emily has run away. She has fled with a man, leaving a letter begging forgiveness and swearing never to return unless she comes back a lady. When the grief-stricken Mr. Peggotty demands the name of the seducer, the betrothed, in anguish, names Steerforth. Mr. Peggotty, struck to the heart, declares he will seek his niece through the whole world and bring her back, while the widowed housekeeper pleads with him to be calm. David, sharing in their desolation, weeps with them, knowing that his own beloved friend has wrought this ruin upon the simple, honest home he loved. So comedy and courtship give way to catastrophe. The cruelty hidden beneath Steerforth's charm is laid bare, and the happiness of the fishing household is broken in a single night. In the aftermath of Emily's flight, David never loves Steerforth's memory more than now that the bond between them is broken, mourning the noble man his friend might have been even as he condemns the ruin he caused. Mr. Peggotty resolves to leave his work and seek his niece across the world, asking only that the old boat be kept lit and ready should she ever creep home. The once mournful widowed housekeeper is transformed by sorrow into a tireless, devoted helper, and David marvels at the change. Late one night, the comic dwarf hairdresser appears in earnest distress, revealing that she was tricked into carrying a letter that helped lure Emily, and she vows to do all she can to find the lost girl. David accompanies Mr. Peggotty to confront Steerforth's proud mother, who coldly refuses any thought of marriage between her son and a girl so far below him, while her fierce-scarred companion rages that she would have the girl whipped. Mr. Peggotty departs with no hope but unchanged love, setting out alone to seek his niece, and David long remembers his solitary figure toiling on through the world. David's love for Dora burns brighter than ever, his refuge in all this grief. He settles Peggotty's affairs and, calling at the proctor's office, again meets his stepfather taking a licence for a new young wife, and learns the man means to break and crush this bride, as he did David's mother. David and Dora become formally engaged through her sympathetic friend, exchanging a ring of forget-me-nots and quarrelling and reconciling in a haze of foolish, happy young love. He writes to Agnes of his engagement, and she replies with cordial kindness. But fresh trouble strikes. Traddles helps recover the Micawber's furniture from a broker, and David learns the family is leaving London once more. Then returning to his chambers, David is astonished to find his aunt, Betsy Trotwood, arrived with all her luggage, her birds and cat, and her gentle companion. She announces, with composed courage, that she is ruined. Her fortune is gone, and all she has left is the cottage and what she has brought to his rooms. She declares they must meet reverses boldly and live misfortune down. David's whole world is shaken, for he must now consider how to live, how to help his aunt, and whether honour requires him to release Dora from her engagement now that he is poor. His aunt teaches him a lesson in courage, drinking ale instead of wine to save expense and refusing to be frightened. She gently warns him, too, that he is blind, hinting that earnestness and steadiness of heart are what truly matter, and David feels a vague, unhappy sense of something missing. He resolves to act, to try whether his articles can be cancelled and the premium recovered, and to find some honest way to support them all. So David passes from the heartbreak of betrayal and the long, hopeless search for the lost girl, through the giddy joy of his secret engagement, to the sudden collapse of his fortunes, until at last he is thrown wholly upon his own strength and resolve. Faced with his aunt's ruin, David sets out to meet the change with resolution. He tries to have his articles cancelled and the premium recovered, but is baffled by the two partners, each blaming the other as the immovable obstacle, and the £1,000 is lost beyond recall. Walking homeward in despondency, he meets Agnes, who has come to London with her father and the humble red-haired clerk, now her father's partner. Agnes is a steadying presence, like hope embodied, and David's spirits lift at once. His aunt explains how her money was lost through bad investments, and Agnes listens with secret fear that her own father may have been to blame, until the story clears him. Agnes, ever his good angel, suggests that David seek work as secretary to his old schoolmaster, the kindly scholar who has retired to London, and David eagerly writes to him. When Agnes's father and the clerk arrive, David is shocked at the lawyer's decline, broken and dependent, submitting to the crawling clerk who now holds him in his power. The clerk fawns and writhes, the lawyer dully echoes his praise, and Agnes shrinks from the man's ill-favoured smile, while David's aunt sharply orders the squirming clerk to control himself. David begins his new life with fierce energy, rising at 5, walking everywhere fast, taking on the post of secretary to the gentle old scholar, who is delighted to set him to work on his endless dictionary. He resolves to learn shorthand and become a parliamentary reporter, treating each difficulty as a tree to be cut down in the forest of difficulty that stands between him and Dora. He visits the old scholar's home and finds his young wife pale and unhappy, watched over by her idle cousin, lately returned from abroad and given an easy patent place. David also finds a way to make his aunt's gentle companion useful and happy by setting him to copy legal documents. And the simple man earns his first wages with tears of pride and joy. Meanwhile, the irrepressible Mr. Micawber writes to announce that something has at last turned up. He is to become confidential clerk to the humble red-haired clerk at Canterbury. David visits the Micawbers as they prepare to migrate, and Mr. Micawber, full of his usual eloquence and self-disparagement, even pays off his debt to Traddles with a grand flourish, recovering his moral dignity. David, working harder than ever, reveals his poverty to Dora, who is bewildered and frightened by the idea, unable to grasp the need to work or economize, begging him not to be dreadful or practical. Her sympathetic friend gently helps reconcile them, and David, charmed and despairing by turns, sees that his child wife cannot be made into a counsellor, yet loves her all the more. So David turns hardship into resolution, throwing himself into honest labour for the sake of his aunt and his love, while the shadow of the creeping clerk over Agnes and her father grows ever darker and more dangerous. David labours at the tremendous mystery of shorthand, helped by Traddles, who dictates mock parliamentary speeches while David's aunt and her gentle companion play at being the government and opposition. His employer, Dora's father, suddenly turns cold and summons David to a coffee house, where the grim sister of his cruel stepfather, now Dora's companion, produces David's love letters, which she has discovered through the little dog. The secret engagement is exposed. Dora's father is offended, but more troubled by the difference in their years and fortunes than truly angry, and he urges David to take a week to consider and to forget the foolish business. David, resolute in his love, refuses. Then catastrophe strikes again. Dora's father is found dead, thrown from his carriage on the road home. David is overwhelmed with grief and a strange, jealous wish to be all in all to the weeping Dora. It emerges that the dead man left no will, his affairs are in disorder, and little remains. Dora is taken away to live with 2 elderly maiden aunts at Putney. David's mind runs constantly on the question of how he can ever marry her now. David travels to Canterbury, drawn by the quiet influence of Agnes that seems to pervade the very city. He finds Mr. Micawber installed as the humble clerk's confidential man, oddly constrained and guarded, drawing a strange line between friendship and the affairs of the firm. Agnes, writing in her old room, is glad to see him, and David, with her gentle counsel, resolves to write honourably to Dora's aunts, asking leave to visit her. He stays in the Wickfield house, now overshadowed by the crawling clerk and his fawning mother, who watch and knit like 2 great bats darkening the home. Walking out, David is followed by the clerk, who reveals openly that he means to marry Agnes and to use his power over her father to gain her, boasting of how his lifelong training in false humility has bred in him a base, revengeful spirit hungry for power. David, sickened, declares Agnes far above him. That evening the clerk, flushed with triumph, plies the broken lawyer with drink and toasts Agnes as the one he means to make his wife, until her father rises in a terrible cry of anguish, confessing how weak indulgence has ruined him and delivered him into the monster's hands. Agnes gently leads her father away, and David, enraged, strikes the clerk a blow, only to be met with hollow, gloating forgiveness. Meanwhile, David's aunt is troubled by a mysterious man, who proves to be her long-lost, cruel husband, living but dead to her, to whom she secretly gives money to keep him away. And on a snowy night, David encounters Mr. Peggotty, returned weary from his long search across France, Italy, and Switzerland, ever following rumours of his lost niece. He shows David the money she has secretly sent back, untouched, and sets out once more, vowing to seek her through the world and to forgive her always. So the secret engagement is laid bare. Dora's father is lost. The clerk's menace over Agnes deepens, and the patient, sorrowful search for the fallen girl begins again across the wide world. David receives at last a reply from Dora's 2 elderly maiden aunts, who invite him, with a confidential friend, to call and discuss the question of his courtship. He takes Traddles, fretting all the way about his friend's unmanageably upright hair, and learns of Traddles's own long, comical and painful struggle to win the consent of his betrothed's family. The 2 little bird-like aunts receive them with prim formality, one of them an authority on affairs of the heart, by reason of a long-ago admirer who never quite declared himself. After careful, twittering deliberation, they agree to admit David's visits, on condition that nothing be done without their knowledge, and that he abide by their conditions. David, in ecstasy, binds himself to the terms, and is at last reunited with Dora, whom he finds hiding behind a door with the little dog tied up in a towel. Dora is overjoyed but frightened, declaring she does not like his sensible friend and dreading the visit of his sharp aunt. The courtship now proceeds openly, with David allowed to visit, and his aunt and Dora's aunts rubbing along more smoothly than he had feared, his aunt regarded as an eccentric but kindly lady. David tries to improve Dora, giving her a cookery book and an account book, hoping she might learn to keep house and acquire some habit of accounts. But the figures make her head ache and the cookery book makes her cry, and the volume ends up chiefly as a stand for the little dog to balance on. David sees that his child wife cannot be made practical, and he loves her too dearly to press her. He brings Agnes to meet Dora, and the 2 women take to each other at once, Dora shyly delighting in Agnes's gentle goodness, while Agnes lovingly commends the pretty creature David has won. David also learns, through a distressing scene witnessed by chance, that the creeping clerk is now scheming against the schoolmaster's young wife, hinting darkly that she and her cousin are too fond of one another, and forcing the old scholar to confront the supposed unhappiness of his marriage. The good old scholar, in perfect dignity and trust, refuses to doubt his wife and takes all the blame upon himself, resolving only to make her happier. David, enraged at being entrapped into the clerk's scheme, strikes him again. Letters arrive from Mrs. Micawber lamenting that her husband has grown morose, secret, and estranged in the clerk's service, and David begins to suspect dark doings at Canterbury. Time passes in a haze of weeks and seasons, and David, now come of age, has tamed the savage mystery of shorthand and become a parliamentary reporter, has begun to write and be published, and is at last to be married. The 2 little aunts, his own aunt, his nurse, and his friends, all bustle about the wedding. The day itself passes for David like a flustered, happy, hurried dream, in which he can hardly believe it is real, until at last he and Dora drive away together as man and wife, and he believes it at last. She is his dear little wife, beside him, whom he loves so well. These chapters carry David from anxious courtship through tender comedy to the fulfilment of his boyish dream in marriage. David and Dora settle into married life, and David quickly discovers how little either of them knows about keeping house. Their servants cheat them, their meals fail, their accounts will not add up, and the little dog walks over the housekeeping book and smears the figures. David's aunt wisely refuses to interfere, telling him that their future is theirs alone to work out, and warning him to value Dora for the qualities she has, rather than those she lacks. Dora, tearful when he tries to reason with her, asks him to think of her as his child wife, to be forgiven her foolishness because she loves him, and David, moved, accepts her as she is. Yet a quiet, undefined sense of something missing pervades his happiness, and he sometimes wishes his wife could be his counsellor and share his deeper thoughts. He tries for a time to form Dora's mind, reading her serious books and dropping useful scraps of wisdom, but he only depresses her and disconcerts himself, and at last he abandons the attempt, resolving to be content with his loving, childish wife and to keep his secret regrets in his own breast. A page boy they engage turns out to be a thief who robs them and confesses his crimes by installments, eventually being transported, and this leads David to reflect uneasily that their want of system corrupts everyone around them. Meanwhile, David sees more of his old schoolmaster, the kindly scholar, whose young wife has grown shadowed and unhappy under the dark suspicion the creeping clerk has planted. The wife's frivolous, pleasure-loving mother, called the old soldier, unknowingly deepens the scholar's fear that he has ensnared his young wife into an unhappy marriage. The gentle, simple-minded companion of David's aunt, with the subtle perception of true affection, senses the trouble and quietly devotes himself to bringing the estranged pair together, declaring that a poor simple fellow may do what wiser people cannot. He succeeds. In a memorable scene, the young wife kneels at her husband's feet and lays bare her whole heart, declaring that she has never wronged him, that she was saved from a mistaken youthful impulse by marrying him, and that there can be no disparity in marriage like unsuitability of mind and purpose. The old scholar is overjoyed, the false suspicion is dispelled, and David's aunt warmly praises her gentle companion. Yet the wife's words about the first mistaken impulse of an undisciplined heart sink deep into David, recurring to him again and again. Through all this, the long search for the lost girl goes on. David visits Steerforth's mother and her fierce companion, who summon the respectable manservant to report coldly how Steerforth tired of the girl and abandoned her abroad, proposing she marry the servant himself, and how she fled and vanished. David, sickened, resolves to tell the faithful fisherman, and seeks out the fallen woman who once knew Emily, hoping she may help find her, sensing that the girl may yet make her way to London. So the comedy and quiet sorrow of David's marriage runs side by side with the reconciliation of the old scholar and the renewed hope of finding the lost girl. The picture that emerges is of a young man who has won the wife he longed for, only to learn that love alone cannot supply everything a heart needs, and who must teach himself to bear that lack with tenderness rather than reproach. Around him, the troubles of others mirror his own quiet lesson, for the old scholar's faith in his young wife is rewarded, while David is left to weigh the difference between the marriage he dreamed of and the marriage he has, all the while never wavering in his gentle care for the woman he calls his child wife. David and the kindly fisherman follow the fallen woman through the night streets of Westminster, fearing she means to drown herself in the river. They reach her just as her despair is at its height, and she cries out that the river is the only thing fit for her. They calm her, and the fisherman, with deep gentleness, tells her that she is innocent of any part in his niece's ruin, and asks her to help find the lost girl, promising to trust her fully. The fallen woman, weeping with gratitude, vows to devote herself to the search faithfully, and to bring word the moment she finds her, refusing all money lest it take away the trust that alone saves her from the river. She goes off into the desolate night, and David and the fisherman, reliant on her, return home with new and thoughtful hope. Arriving at his aunt's cottage near midnight, David is surprised to see her secretly giving money to the shabby, ill-dressed man who has troubled her before, and pleading with him to leave her in peace. When the man slouches away, David's aunt confides the truth at last. The man is her husband, long dead to her but living, who once broke her fortune and nearly her heart, and to whom she still gives money, for the sake of what she once believed him to be, to keep him away. She dismisses the grumpy, frumpy story and asks David never to speak of it again. David's own affairs prosper. His book is published and successful. He leaves the dreary parliamentary reporting, and he and Dora keep a page and a quarrelsome cook. Their household troubles continue, but David, learning the lesson of his undisciplined heart, resolves to adapt himself to Dora, rather than try to change her, to share what he can and bear the rest, and this discipline makes his life happier. He gently fails to form her mind and at last accepts and loves her as his child wife, buying her earrings and a collar for the dog, and resolving to keep his quiet sorrow in his own breast. Then a strange letter arrives from Mr. Micawber, full of dark hints of villainy and despair, summoning David to meet him outside the debtor's prison. A separate letter reaches Traddles from Mrs. Micawber, lamenting that her husband has grown wild, secret and estranged, asserting that he has sold himself to the devil. David and Traddles meet Mr. Micawber, who is broken and bitter, his old genteel air drooping, full of misery over his employer, the creeping red-haired clerk. They bring him to David's aunt's house at Highgate, where the gentle, simple-minded companion shakes his hand many times in friendly warmth. At last, Mr. Micawber, attempting to make punch but breaking down in agitation, bursts out that all his troubles spring from villainy, baseness, fraud, and conspiracy, and that the name of the whole atrocious mass is Heap. In a passion of pent-up rage, he denounces the clerk as a detestable scoundrel and a transcendent hypocrite, vowing to expose him utterly. He appoints a meeting a week hence at Canterbury, where everything shall be revealed, and rushes out, leaving the household in a state of excitement, hope, and wonder. These chapters enlist the fallen woman in the search, lay bare the aunt's secret sorrow, deepen David's discipline of his own heart, and set the stage for the unmasking of the scheming clerk. The fallen woman keeps her promise. One evening she leads David through the swarming streets of London to a wretched lodging-house, where, hidden in a small garret, he overhears Steerforth's fierce, scarred companion confronting little Emily with cold cruelty, taunting and threatening her, and bidding her hide herself or die. Just as the cruelty reaches its height, the foot of the kindly fisherman is heard on the stairs. He rushes in with a great cry, gathers his fainting niece into his arms, and carries her away at last, thanking heaven that his dream has come true and his darling is found. The next morning the fisherman tells David and his aunt the whole story of Emily's flight and recovery, how she fled in the night, was sheltered by a kind young woman abroad, fell ill and lost the language of that country, and how, when the seducer's servant proposed she marry him, she escaped and made her way back to England in shame and dread, until the fallen woman, true to her promise, saved her on the brink of ruin. The fisherman resolves to emigrate with his niece to Australia, where no one can reproach her, and they may begin a new life, leaving the old boat lit and ready, and providing for the widowed housekeeper and for the heartbroken Ham. David travels with him to Yarmouth, where he visits the cheerful old undertaker, now wheeled about in his chair, and learns of the kindness everyone has shown. He meets Ham, who, with manly sorrow, asks David to tell Emily that he forgives her and begs her forgiveness, and that she must not believe he is greatly hurt or could ever marry another. The old boat home is emptied and given up, and the widowed housekeeper, transformed by devotion, pleads so movingly to go with them that the fisherman takes her too. Meanwhile, the great unmasking comes at Canterbury. At the appointed meeting, with David, his aunt, Traddles, and the gentle companion present, Mr. Micawber, with tremendous formality and relish, reads out a long letter denouncing the red-haired clerk as a forger and a cheat who has systematically falsified the lawyer's business, forged his signature, plundered the trusting old man, and warped his weaknesses to base purposes, all proved by the clerk's own books, and a partially burned pocket-book recovered from the ashes. The clerk, exposed and brought to bay, drops his crawling mask and reveals his malice and hatred, threatening and blustering, but Traddles, with plain practical good sense, lays out the terms. He must give up the deed of relinquishment, make full restitution, and surrender all the books and papers. David's aunt suddenly seizes the clerk by the collar, demanding her stolen property, and it emerges that her ruin was largely his doing, the money never lost but taken by his fraud. The clerk, a coward at heart, is compelled to submit and is left in safekeeping. The Micawbers are joyfully reconciled, and David's aunt proposes that they too emigrate to Australia, offering to find the capital, and Mr. and Mrs. Micawber embrace the plan with delight, the husband instantly the most sanguine of men, looking on to fortune. These chapters bring the long search to its tender close, restore the lost girl to her uncle, and at last tear the mask from the scheming clerk and undo his villainy. David pauses to dwell on the slow fading of his child wife. Dora has long been ill, and David carries her up and down the stairs each day, her old companion, the little dog, grown old and feeble beside her. She lies smiling and beautiful, uttering no complaint, speaking tenderly of their wedding day and longing to see Agnes. When Agnes comes, Dora asks to speak with her alone. David, sitting below with the old dog, dimly knows that his child wife will soon leave him, though he cannot fully take the truth to heart. Dora speaks to him with gentle sorrow of herself as past, confessing that she was too young to be a wife, that he might have wearied of his child wife in time, and that it is better as it is, for she could never have improved or been the companion he needed. David weeps and protests, but she comforts him, asking only that he give Agnes her dear love. That night, while David sits below, the old dog crawls out, looks at him, and dies with a plaintive cry, and in the same moment Agnes appears at the top of the stairs, her face full of pity and grief, her hand raised toward heaven, and David knows that Dora is dead. Darkness comes before his eyes, and all things are blotted from his remembrance. In the aftermath, the loss grows upon David slowly, and Agnes becomes a sacred, compassionate presence in his lonely house. It is settled that he shall go abroad to seek peace in change and travel, after the affairs of the disgraced firm are wound up and the emigrants have sailed. At Canterbury, Traddles, the most devoted of friends, has been labouring to set things right, and reports that the lawyer's business can be wound up with no deficiency, that David's aunt's money has been recovered in full, the fraud of the red-haired clerk laid bare, and the gentle companion and Mr. Micawber praised for their tireless help. The Micawbers prepare cheerfully for emigration, full of business-like resolutions and grand schemes, Mrs. Micawber declaring she will never desert her husband and that he is destined to be a page of history. David's aunt, who has been mysteriously troubled, at last reveals that her long-estranged husband has died in a hospital, and she follows his plain coffin to the churchyard where he was born, mourning the fine-looking man she married 36 years before. Then comes the great storm. David, returning to Yarmouth to carry Emily's parting letter to Ham, finds the coast battered by a tremendous tempest. A ship is wrecked close to shore, and amid the howling sea and the agony of the watching crowd, a single figure with long curling hair clings to the mast. Ham, the heartbroken boatman, braves the murderous waves with a rope to try to save him, but a great hillside of water sweeps over the wreck, and Ham is drawn back to shore dead, beaten to death by the sea, his generous heart stilled forever. And on the beach, among the ruins of the home he had wronged, David finds washed ashore the body of his old friend Steerforth, lying with his head upon his arm as David had so often seen him lie at school. These chapters carry David through the death of his child wife and the double catastrophe of the storm, in which both the noble boatman and the brilliant, ruinous friend are destroyed together. David is left to face the new wound of Steerforth's death and the old grief of his child wife together. He takes on the hard duty of carrying the news to Steerforth's mother at Highgate, sparing the emigrants the knowledge of the catastrophe so that they may sail in ignorance. At the proud, gloomy house he finds the mother an invalid, and as gently as he can he breaks the news that her son is dead. The fierce, scarred companion bursts into a frightful passion, crying that the proud mother has reaped the harvest of her pampering and pride, and revealing how she herself loved the dead man better than his mother ever did, how he gave her the scar in a boyish rage, and how she descended into being his plaything and was cast aside. The mother sinks into a rigid, moaning stupor, and David leaves the two women locked in their terrible grief, the scarred companion rocking the impassive figure like a child. David lays Steerforth in his mother's room and darkens the windows of the dreary house. He keeps the disaster secret from the emigrants. Mr. Micawber, in a bold, buccaneering air, undertakes to stand between the kindly fisherman and any news of the tragedy. The whole Micawber family is cleared for action, dressed for the voyage, and lodged in a tumble-down public house by the river stairs. David's aunt and Agnes help make extra comforts for the children, and his nurse quietly assists. Mr. Micawber is repeatedly arrested for debt and as repeatedly set free by David, settling his transactions with great form in his pocketbook and paying off Traddles with a grand flourish. Mrs. Micawber declares she will never desert her husband and that he is destined to take a commanding station in Australia, to be the Caesar of his own fortunes. The emigrants gather on the wooden steps to watch their property loaded, and David takes his weeping nurse down to Gravesend to see the ship sail. On board, in the crowded dark space between decks, David glimpses Emily at her uncle's side, and the fallen woman who helped save her is taken too, to begin a new life. As the ship moves away into the radiant sunset, 3 resounding cheers break from the boats, and David sees Emily wave her last goodbye, clinging to her uncle who has clung to her through all. The night falls darkly upon David as he is rowed ashore. He then goes abroad, not knowing how great the shock is that he has to bear, and the desolation deepens upon him hour by hour as he roams from place to place carrying his burden. For many months he travels under an ever-darkening cloud, listless to everything but brooding sorrow, until one evening, descending into a peaceful Swiss valley as the sun shines on the snowy heights, great nature speaks to him, and he weeps as he has not wept since his child-wife died. He finds awaiting him a letter from Agnes, full of fervent trust, telling him that sorrow will exalt and strengthen him, commending him to God and cherishing him always. From that hour the night begins to pass from his mind. He resolves to remain abroad, to seek out nature and human friendship, and to resume his pen. He works hard, his health and reputation grow, and he comes to understand that he has long loved Agnes, and that in his wayward boyhood he threw away the treasure of her love, which he now believes is lost to him forever. These chapters carry David through the depths of grief, the sailing of the emigrants, and his slow healing abroad, while quietly turning his heart at last toward Agnes. David returns to England after 3 years abroad. Landing in London on a wintry evening, he surprises his old friend Traddles, now married at last to his patient, cheerful Sophie, and lodging in chambers crowded with her many sisters, the whole household full of song and good humour despite their modest means. David is delighted to find his friend so happy and beginning to rise in the world. By chance he also meets the mild old doctor who attended his birth, now settled in the country, and learns from him the fate of the Murdstones. The cruel stepfather has married another young wife, and he and his grim sister have crushed her spirit, as they crushed David's mother, their austere religion grown ever darker and more tyrannical. David travels down to Dover, where his aunt, his nurse, and the gentle companion welcome him with open arms. His aunt tells him much news of the emigrants, who write home cheerfully, and of Mr. Micawber, who has even remitted small sums of money. She also gently probes David's heart, telling him that she suspects Agnes has an attachment and is going to be married, which fills David with quiet regret, for he feels he has thrown away her love by his own choice. The next morning, David rides to Canterbury to see Agnes, resolving to guard their sisterly affection with religious care, and to do his duty by her. He finds the old house restored to its happy order, the creeping clerk gone, and Agnes as good and beautiful as ever. He longs to know her secret, but she is uneasy, and he lets it pass. Her father, now a white-haired, reclaimed man, tells David the sad story of Agnes's mother, who married against her hard father's wish, was repulsed and broken-hearted, and died young, leaving Agnes to be his comfort. David resolves to keep his love hidden and to remain near her, ever pointing upward. He settles at Dover to complete his book, occasionally visiting London, where his growing fame brings him crowds of letters. He shares his name on Traddles's door and delights in his friend's happy, hard-working, frugal married life. Then, at the invitation of his old schoolmaster, now a magistrate full of professed tenderness for prisoners, David and Traddles visit a great new model prison run on the system of solitary confinement, supposed to produce sincere converts and penitents. There they find the proudest model prisoners to be none other than the unmasked, red-haired clerk and Steerforth's respectable manservant, both transported for their crimes, the one for a great bank fraud, the other for robbing his young master. The two hypocrites parade their false humility and pretended repentance, the clerk forgiving David and wishing everyone could be brought to prison, the servant lamenting the follies of his former companions. David learns that the servant was caught by the comic dwarf hairdresser, who held him fast until he was taken, and he respects her for it. He and Traddles leave the prison wondering at the hollow, suggestive folly of the whole business. These chapters carry David home to his friends, restore the broken household, reveal the fate of his old enemies, and turn his heart ever more longingly, yet still hopelessly, toward Agnes. As Christmas approaches, David, having finished his book and grown ever more devoted to Agnes, resolves to break down the barrier he fears stands between them. Tormented by the thought that she may be restraining herself from giving him pain, and that his own sacrifice is therefore worthless, he determines to learn the truth. His aunt tells him she believes Agnes is going to be married, and David, summoning all his resolution, rides through the wintry day to Canterbury. He finds Agnes alone and asks her to share her secret, offering to be her brother in whatever concerns her happiness. Agnes bursts into tears, and those tears awaken hope in David. He speaks plainly at last, telling her that he could never envy her happiness or grudge her to a dearer protector, that there is no alloy of self in what he feels for her. Agnes, gathering her composure, tells him he is mistaken, that her secret is no new one, and is not what he supposes, and that it must remain hers. But as new hope brightens, David pours out his heart, confessing that he loves her, that he went away loving her, stayed away loving her, and returned home loving her, and asking whether she can take him for something more than a sister. Agnes, weeping with joy, lays her head upon his breast, and confesses that she has loved him all her life. They walk together in the winter evening, blessed and at peace, and thank God for guiding them to this happiness. David's aunt, who had practised a kind of pious fraud or genuine mistake to bring them together, goes into hysterics of delight, hugging his nurse and the gentle companion in turn. David and Agnes are married within a fortnight, with only their dearest friends present, and Agnes at last tells him that the dying Dora's last request was that only Agnes should occupy the vacant place in his heart. 10 happy years pass. David has advanced in fame and fortune, and his home with Agnes and their children is perfect. One spring evening, the kindly fisherman, now a ruddy, hearty old man, arrives from Australia, where he and his niece have thrived. He tells of Emily, grown quiet, gentle and sorrowful, devoting herself to kindness and never marrying, of the fallen woman who married a farm labourer and lives content, of the widowed housekeeper who refused a suitor with a bucket over his head, and of Mr. Micawber, now a respected colonial magistrate, honoured at a public dinner, and writing grand letters to the newspapers. Before he returns, the fisherman goes with David to Yarmouth to see the little tablet raised to the memory of the heroic boatman, and gathers a tuft of grass and earth from the grave for Emily. At last, David looks back over his life for the final time, seeing the faces dearest to him, his upright old aunt and his loving nurse, both in spectacles now, the gentle companion still flying his kites and finishing his memorial, the proud Steerforth mother and her scarred companion worn away by their grief, the worldly friend of Dora's girlhood steeped in money and discontent, the kindly old doctor at his dictionary, and his faithful friend Traddles risen at last, surrounded by a happy household. Above and beyond them all shines one face, Agnes, beside him in beautiful serenity, ever pointing upward. David prays that when realities melt from him at the close of his life, she may still be near him, pointing upward. These chapters bring David's long story to its tender close in love, peace, and the quiet triumph of a disciplined and faithful heart. When I look back over the whole sweep of this life story, I think the book is above all a study of the heart and of how a person grows into goodness or is twisted away from it. I believe the author was drawing attention to the difference between charm and worth, between what dazzles us and what truly sustains us. Again and again the story sets brilliance beside steadiness and shows us which one endures. The friend who shines so brightly, who can win any heart and master any skill, brings ruin to a simple home and at last destroys himself, while the plain, patient, hard-working man rises slowly to happiness and honour. I think the story is quietly telling me that the qualities the world admires least, perseverance, diligence, fidelity, and earnestness, are the ones that matter most, and that there is no substitute for thoroughgoing, sincere effort. The book seems to me to return constantly to the phrase about the undisciplined heart, and to the idea that there can be no disparity in marriage like unsuitability of mind and purpose. Through the narrator's tender, foolish first love and his loss, the story suggests that to set one's earliest and brightest hopes wisely, and to discipline the heart before it is too late, is among the hardest and most important lessons of a life. I also believe the author may have been drawing attention to the cruelty that the powerful inflict on the weak and the way it deforms both. The harsh stepfather and his grim sister, who call their tyranny firmness, break a gentle mother and a small boy. The savage schoolmaster delights in beating helpless children, and the cold, proud mother pampers her son's pride until it ruins everyone near him. The story highlights how cruelty dressed up as discipline, or as religion, or as social superiority, does lasting harm, and it sets against this the simple, open-handed kindness of poor fishermen, faithful servants, and ridiculous debt-ridden friends who love one another. The book seems to honour the humble and the loyal far above the proud and the genteel. There is also, I think, a warning about hypocrisy and false humility. The creeping clerk, who is forever proclaiming how humble he is, turns out to be the most dangerous and grasping figure of all, his crawling meekness a mask for a base, revengeful hunger for power. The story suggests that humility worn as a trade and repentance professed for advantage are among the worst of vices, and it exposes them with quiet contempt, even in the model prison where the worst men make the loudest show of being reformed. Finally, I believe the book is a tribute to the redeeming power of faithful, self-denying love, embodied in the quiet woman who is always pointing upward. The story seems to say that a life can be saved and shaped by such steady devotion, and that fortune is far less worth having than goodness, peace, and truth. In the end, I think the author may be urging me to value the unshowy virtues, to discipline my own heart, to be never mean, never false, never cruel, and to recognize that the brightest light in any life is faithful love. Thank you for staying till the end of David Copperfield. You obviously are a glutton for punishment. Please hit the like icon if you thought this video deserves it, so other people get to see it. Let me know in the comments which book you would like me to read to you next. Now YouTube have put on screen a channel subscribe icon, and below it my latest video for you to check out. See you next time.